Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review episode 4 of season 5 of Star Trek Discovery called Face the Strange. And I cannot decide if this is the worst episode or the best episode of this season because, in terms of pure logic, it is absolutely the worst one because nothing makes any sense at all. It's absolutely ridiculous in every way. However, it also felt kind of entertaining. Maybe because it's so ridiculous, a lot of parts in it were kind of unintentional comedy. And I also do have to admit that in a lot of episodes of the older Star Trek shows, there were often a lot of ridiculous ideas which didn't really make much sense, but as long as it was entertaining overall, you could kind of forgive it and roll with it, even though it did kind of annoy me sometimes, especially in Voyager. I remember the technobubble was pretty terrible in a lot of places. And there was a specific episode of Voyager, which reminds me of this episode of Discovery, in which Voyager was kind of split into different time eras, and so whenever Janeway went into different parts of the ship, she ended up in different time periods from previous seasons. And it was pretty ridiculous, but it was also kind of fun because, you had cameos of all kinds of characters from previous seasons and there were all kinds of funny situations. And so I think it probably inspired this episode because there's something very similar here. We see Michael and Rainer kind of jumping through time to different periods of Discovery from the previous seasons. And so it did create all kinds of fun situations and some unintentional comedy. The funniest to me was seeing Tilly back in her season 1 uniform in those parts that taking place as if in season 1 of Discovery, and yet Tilly, and I didn't want to say anything, but you can always tell which season of Discovery it is based on Tilly's measurements. The same way as Riker in TNG. If you show me any picture of Riker, I can immediately know which season it is. And I love Jonathan Frakes, I love the actress who plays Tilly, so I don't want to offend anyone, but you can tell which season it is by just looking at her. And putting her back in her season 1 uniform and pretending as if it's taking place in season 1 and thinking we just wouldn't notice, that is kind of hilarious to me. And also, we know she had some plastic surgery to remove a few of the moles on her face, and yet in those scenes taking place in the past, when she had those moles, she suddenly don't have them. So that creates kind of a continuity mistake as well as her weight. And so I can't really say it annoys me so much because it kind of entertained me more than it's annoying to me, but I just have to point it out. No offense to any of the actors. And we also got to see season 1 Michael again with her old haircut and all of that, but the way she was acting as if it was Mirror Universe Michael and not season 1 Michael. So that was a little bit ridiculous, but all those scenes taking place in different eras was actually kind of fun. So that's why I'm willing to roll with it, even though the whole premise of it was absolutely ridiculous. It all starts with a flashback scene to show us how Skrull and Shin Hoti got their hands on that time bug that they used to create all this chaos. And it was apparently before they went to Trill, and all it was meant to do apparently was just to disable Discovery. So, in the previous episode, I assumed that thing that she planted on Adira was simply some kind of tracking device to know where Discovery will go next, so they can follow them and get Discovery to do all the difficult work of figuring out the clues, and then they can just come in and steal it. That's what I assumed, that's what would make sense. But no, apparently it was just meant to disable Discovery. It basically puts the ship into some kind of temporal flux kind of thing, in which some people who just happen to be beaming somewhere in that moment, they're the only ones who would be aware of it, but all the others wouldn't be. So how exactly does that stop the ship? Does it freeze the ship? Like, how would it look like from the outside? They never actually explain it. It doesn't actually make any sense. How exactly would it look like from the side? Like, is Discovery frozen in time in that moment that it was activated or what? Like, it doesn't really make any sense. And they say it's cranium technology, it's a leftover from the temporal wars, and that was actually a species we saw in Voyager. Those were the ones who were masters of manipulating the timeline, trying to change the timeline to their own needs. And so they said previously on this show that all the time traveling technology was destroyed and banned, and yet apparently some criminals still keep it around and no one else can detect it or find it. So it kind of makes it ridiculous. If you cannot actually enforce this ban, then you just put yourself in a position of weakness. If you no longer have any temporal police, How are you going to stop criminals from still using temporal technology to do this kind of thing? And they specifically say, while they are in the past, that their actions do have consequences, meaning they have to be careful not to change anything in the past, because they might change or erase the things that Discovery did. And remember, Discovery saved all life in the galaxy, so why the hell would Skrull and Shin-Hoti risk doing it to Discovery when they know all of it? They know that Discovery saved the whole galaxy, and yet they put Discovery into this position in which they might destroy their own past and erase everything they did from history, changing all the timelines, so they would risk endangering the whole galaxy and themselves in it. And so that's what makes it so ridiculous. Why would the hell would they do that on such an important ship whose past is so important to everyone in the galaxy? If not for Discovery, then they wouldn't find the dilithium planet. If not for Discovery, all life in the galaxy might not exist. And so, since they know all of it, why the hell would they do it to Discovery? And apparently, this criminal was willing to sell this time bug to them for just a few bars of platinum. Not even dilithium. Like, why are they not trading with dilithium, since that is a substance with actual importance in this future in which it ran out in the whole galaxy and only the Federation has the main supply? And once again in this episode we hear that all they really want is money. They just want to be free because they have a bounty on their heads and they want to pay it off and finally be free and not be afraid anymore. So if that's the case, why doesn't the Federation simply pay them? The Federation controls the biggest and technically only supply of dilithium in the whole galaxy. They've been giving it out for free to everyone else in the previous season for some reason, with no strings attached, and suddenly they constantly say that the Breen is now a huge threat to the Federation, and they never explained how come, how did the Breen get their hands on so much dilithium, they're now a big enemy. And we have a scene in this episode taking place in the future in which the Breen destroyed the whole Federation, because Shin-Hoti sold them the progenitor technology, because they were the highest bidders. And so it makes me think, why didn't the Federation simply pay them with dilithium as much as they want and simply solve all the problems that way? So they have the biggest supply of dilithium in the galaxy, and yet they cannot simply pay them. And apparently it takes only a few bars of platinum to buy this super duper time bug that can endanger all of history by putting Discovery into this strange time loop in which a few people who just happen to be transporting in the ship are the only ones who actually get teleported into the past. And so what exactly did it do to the rest of the ship in the present or in the future? Like, how does it look like from the side? I still don't understand. Because once everything comes back to normal, they say that 6 hours are missing. So were they frozen in time during that time? Because, it's not a time loop like in TNG's episode Cause and Effect, in which they were actually repeating, like the whole crew were aware of what was happening because they were actually repeating the same events over and over again. Here it's all taking place in the past, in the literal past, but most of them are not aware of it, so it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, they say that the time bug causes the whole ship to randomly cycle through time, but the ship itself is different because one time it's the retrofitted ship from the future, other times it's the ship from the past before the refit, other times it's the future ship. All the people are the same people from the different time periods. And so what exactly happened with the crew in the present, in the future? Like, is the ship just frozen in time if you look at it from the side? Like, nothing of it is ever explained. And the bug itself, it kind of looks like a T-1000 bug. It kind of goes over the ship and it constantly liquefies and becomes part of the whole. So it's not even clear what is happening. Is it just kind of hiding, or is it literally phasing through the walls, which is a technology that also should exist? Back in Enterprise, we saw that Daniels, who came from the future from before this time period, he had devices that allow him to pass through walls and stuff like that. So is the bug actually passing through walls when it's liquefying? Why does it need to liquefy if that's what it's doing? And so a lot of things don't really make any sense. They just thought, oh, it's just a cool special effect. It's the T-1000 liquid metal kind of spider, which is cool, and that's why we do it. Does it make any sense? No, because it ends up on different decks all the time. So is it beaming to different decks? Is it phase shifting through? It's not ever explained, and it ends up in engineering where it attaches itself to something and then it begins randomly cycle the ship through time. What exactly does that mean is never properly explained, and it doesn't really make any sense. Like how exactly the ship looks like from the side. They say in the future scene that Starfleet somehow rescued the ship from that state in the future since it got stuck like that, but were the crew members literally frozen in time, or were they all going back to the past in a kind of quantum leaping way? So it's not apparently the case, since in the past not all the characters were even in those time periods. Some of them died, some of them never came on board the ship yet, and so where were they then? And so nothing makes any sense if you actually think about it. The only one who seems to be aware of what happened is Stamets, because he has the tardigrade DNA, and that allows him to see beyond linear time, which at least fits with that season 1 episode in which he was the only one aware that the ship was stuck in a time loop. So the same way here, he's kind of aware of the future even though he's in the past. And also Michael and Rainer were just happened to be beaming in that exact moment when it all started, and so they're the only ones who can physically appear in all the different time periods. I guess Stamets is only kind of quantum leaping into his own body in the different time periods, but they actually are physically arriving to the same location, and they're always appearing in the same spot in the ready room where they were standing when they were beaming. And it's funny how their beaming effect, if you freeze it in that moment, it actually kind of looks like Quantum Leap, the same kind of special effect. Maybe it's a coincidence or it's a deliberate homage, I don't know, but somehow they are the only ones who can physically appear in all the different time periods, while Stamets is always in his own body of that same time period, and he can only remember everything that happens in the future. And they say they have to maintain the temporal prime directive since they cannot risk altering the past because they might undo everything Discovery accomplished. And so that again makes me ask, why the hell did Shin Hoti and Skrull not take that into consideration, that it's pretty dangerous to mess up with Discovery's history since they literally saved the whole galaxy. So why would you want to risk that since you live in the same galaxy? So that makes no sense. And they just want some money, and they brought just a few bars of latinum to the guy who is selling it to them. And it's funny how he just keeps it in his pocket, and turns out they poisoned that latinum, so because he touched it, he immediately starts dying in front of them. They say something about him using the same poisoning against other people, so I guess it might be justified, but it is kind of nasty the way they're kind of standing above him as he's dying in a horrible way, and they're just kissing right above that guy which is dying horribly beneath their legs, and they don't care at all. That makes them seem extremely sadistic and psychopathic because it's just kind of a regular thing for them. So I guess it's not the first time they did something like that, since they don't seem to mind at all someone's horrible death. It doesn't let them ruin their romantic mood, and so that makes them almost irredeemable. Maybe that guy deserved it, but still their casual approach to all of it makes them seem extremely evil. And previously I was speculating maybe they'll get redeemed. They added that backstory that Book knows her father, that she's his only family, so I was thinking maybe he will somehow redeem her by the end of the season, but after seeing this scene, I'm not sure they should redeem it. But on this show anything is possible. Just look at what Book did in the previous season and the way the Federation forgave him as if nothing happened, so I guess anything goes. And there's also a bunch of scenes of Michael educating Rainer. She has to put him in his place, she has to teach him how to behave, to force him to do things her way. And it's also so convenient in this episode that everything that happens just happens to convince him that she was right all along. You know how in the previous episode she forced him to get to know the crew on a personal level, and he gave each of them 20 words to say about themselves, which was more character development than they ever had on this entire show. And so now, just one episode later, it just happens to be so conveniently helpful. Like, if not for that, then they wouldn't be able to achieve anything in this episode. Because in all those parts in the past, that's how they're able to convince the people in the past to trust them, because they know about them on a personal level, because they were allowed 20 words to say something about themselves. And so that just happens to be exactly what they needed. So when everything came back to normal in the end, he has to admit to Michael that she was right all along and he was wrong, and she knows best, she's the bestest ever. And so that was also kind of funny. And also we got to hear some more tragic backstories, including from Raynor himself. When he was talking with someone, he said, "Oh, I lost my whole family when I was young too." And so that also made me laugh, because on this show, for some reason, every single character has to have a tragic backstory. So anyway, because Michael and Raynor were just happened to try to beam to the bridge, because it's too hard to walk to the ready room from the bridge, so you have to beam in there and back to the bridge, and just then that bug activated, and that's what caused them to get quantum leaped into the different eras of the ship, which are randomly cycling in the ship. And for some reason their personal transporters don't work while they're in the past. And it's not actually explained why, and it doesn't actually make sense. Didn't they say in the previous seasons that these are actual mobile transporters, meaning even when they're on planets without any ship in orbit, they can still use their badges to beam anywhere they want? So it's an actual personal mobile transporter. So why wouldn't it be working in the past, since it doesn't have to do with the ship's systems? So that's never explained, and each time a cycle ends, they end up back in that ready room in the same position, but if they hold something, then it comes back in time with them, which was very useful. And the first scene they teleport to is while the Discovery was traveling in the wormhole between season 2 and 3, when Michael was the Red Angel, and we can see it in the view screen in front of them. Next, they appear while the Discovery was just being built, and apparently it was being built on Earth, on the surface, right next to the Golden Gate Bridge for some reason, and that's something very annoying in all the new Trek shows and movies. They're always showing starships being built on the surface of a planet, which is not the way it was in the old Star Trek shows. They always show that starships are built in space, since I guess it's easier, you don't have to lift it up later on. I guess it's possible since they do have anti-gravity technology and all that kind of stuff, so I guess it might be possible, but still, we always saw that ships are built in space. Maybe their parts are built on planets and sent up into space, but the final assembly was always in space. And yet in all the new Trek movies and shows, they always show that starships are built on the surface intact until they're finished, and then they fly up. And so here we see the Discovery was being built right next to the Golden Gate Bridge for some reason. I guess it was sitting on the ocean on some platform. They don't actually show it from the outside. And some crew member spots them and immediately thinks it's some kind of an inspection. He doesn't seem suspicious that they have strange uniforms that he never saw before. Somehow he knows they're superior officers and he gets scared that they came early for their inspection. Next, they jump to the time of season 3 when Osira was attacking the ship, and we see those regulators wearing those stupid helmets, which by the way are totally useless because Michael and Raynor start fighting these guys and they punch them in the helmet and they go unconscious, and so what's the point of wearing them? It's almost as ridiculous as stormtroopers in the new Star Wars shows, which also you can just slap someone on the helmet and he will go unconscious. So it provides absolutely no protection apparently. So I guess maybe that's how they were able to so easily defeat these guys when Osira was taking over the ship. Apparently there was more than one Michael fighting these guys on the ship. And these guys are totally pathetic and their helmets give absolutely no protection. And there are also a few scenes in this episode when Jet Reno was the only one to kind of interact with these guys and to almost notice what is happening. So I was suspecting maybe in the end of the episode she'll reveal that she remembers everything since she encountered them in different points in this episode and kind of helped them out. So maybe she was aware of it but kept silent, but apparently not. Apparently no one remembers anything of what happened in the past. Even though they did interact with the people in the past, in the future no one would remember any of it. So why did they say then that they have to maintain the temporal prime directive and be careful not to change anything in the past, if in the end everything comes back to normal and none of it mattered? And so that's also kind of ridiculous. They did say something about if they disable that bug before the cycle is complete, then the changes in the past don't take effect. So I guess that's why in the final segment, none of what they did actually changed the past. And so I guess it makes sense with this technobubble, but still it's kind of ridiculous. And probably the most interesting scene is the one when they appear in the distant future, in which the ship is apparently abandoned and we see dust on the chairs and we hear some music playing, which is played by Zora, and so that immediately made me think they are finally going to explain that short trek. Remember the only good short trek, Calypso, in which Zora was all alone on the ship and the crew all went missing somewhere and she had to wait for them for 1,000 years, she said. And they never actually explained where it fits in the continuity of the show. And they had a few opportunities in the past to somehow explain it, and yet they always missed that opportunity. And so I thought, since it's the final season, that maybe here we'll finally get an explanation for that. Maybe they'll reveal at some point in this episode that the whole ship accidentally got stuck in the past, and so Zora will have to wait until it gets to the same time period in which they started, and then the crew will come back to the ship. Something like that to finally explain that short trek. So we had the scene showing the ship being abandoned and hearing music being played by Zora. So I was absolutely sure we were finally going to get an explanation for that short trek. So I was very happy for a moment, but of course, as always in the show, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So they did not explain anything. And that short trek will, I guess, never will be explained. So it's simply in a different timeline. They're never going to explain it. So that was the last opportunity, and once again they missed it. So it's only taking place about 30 years later, they say. And they explain that after Starfleet rescued the Discovery from being stuck in this state, somehow they rescued them, and then the Breen attacked them because somehow they got their hands on the progenitor tech. Somehow. And then they used it to destroy the Federation somehow, and all the crew got killed, and only Zora stayed on the ship. So why was Discovery not destroyed? I guess the weapon can wipe out all biological life, but if that's the case, why was the station destroyed, the headquarters of the Federation, why was it physically destroyed if all the Breen had to do was use their progenitor tech to wipe out all life, since Discovery seems to be intact, and only missing the crew and only Zora survived? So none of that makes sense. Maybe it will make more sense later on in the season, once they show what the progenitor tech can actually do, so maybe it will make more sense. But what was the most annoying to me is once again they missed the opportunity to explain that short trek. They could have said in the end of all of it that the ship gets stranded in the past, and then they have to hide it somewhere in the nebula to get back into the future where it all started. So they missed that opportunity. So there were some similarities to that short trek, but it doesn't help to connect that continuity mistake of where exactly did the short trek Calypso take place. Especially with the whole retrofit of the ship, it makes no sense since the ship looked like it did in the early seasons in that short trek, and yet it had Zora, which was only on the ship in the later seasons, and so nothing makes any sense as usual. And the dialogue by Zora is ridiculous when she says, somehow the Breen got their hands on the progenitor tech. Do you mean you don't know how? Why wouldn't you tell them how? And isn't it obvious how? Didn't Shin Hoti simply sell it to them? They say that the Breen were the highest bidders. So that makes the Federation look stupid. Why didn't they simply pay her what she wanted to get all the clues and get them out of their hair? And so why not? And also, how come they're trading with Latinum again and not with the lithium the way they were in the early season 3? I guess maybe the Federation simply gave so much dilithium to everyone that it lost its value, like it's no longer used as currency. They once again are using Latinum to buy things and not dilithium. So did the Federation really give so much of it to everyone that it lost its value so much? Didn't that help the Breen Empire rise again to become a major threat? So doesn't that make the Federation seem kind of stupid as well? Why do you give dilithium to everyone, even your potential enemies? And so that's kind of stupid. And in all the scenes in the past, the only interesting cameos are by Arium, who died back in season 2, and we also see the old Mr. No Response, who got replaced by a similar looking dude in the future, and so here they actually see the old one again. And when they were in the future, Zora gave them a hologram showing them exactly how much time they will have in each cycle, and when they're in the past, Michael can still project that same hologram, and when Arium sees that hologram, she looks at it with amazement and says, fascinating technology. And that made me laugh, because didn't they have holograms even back in the 23rd century, which is something I was complaining about when I was reviewing the early seasons. I was saying they shouldn't yet have this technology since, the old Enterprise didn't have holodecks yet. They never seemed to use holograms in the original series and were always amazed to see it being used by other more advanced aliens, and so they shouldn't have had holograms in the first season. And yet in the show, they did show that they did have them all the time. They constantly talked with people through holograms, and it was with high quality holograms. And so why is Arium so amazed to see a hologram? Maybe because she's amazed it's coming out of Michael's comm badge and not from the ship, but still, why is she so fascinated by holographic technology? So that was kind of funny to me. And there was also a scene when she takes that hologram and drops it into a pad that Stamens is holding, and then the pad immediately has that same information. So that also seemed kind of convenient. How is the technology so compatible? How can she simply drop that hologram into a 23rd century datapad and it immediately appears on that pad with no problem? So that also seemed a little bit silly. And after they finally find that time bug on the ship, they're unable to do anything to it because it has temporal shielding. So it causes time to be accelerated around itself. So if someone tries to touch it, it would age so quickly it would disintegrate before touching the bug. So they're unable to do anything. And Stamens says he has to build some special device to be able to get to the bug, and so they need certain materials, and one of them is some kind of fluid which exists in the 32nd century holodecks. And then Michael says she has to get to her quarters to get that fluid, since her quarters in the future just got installed with the holodeck. And I'm thinking, wait, are you telling me the only holodeck on the ship isn't Michael's quarters? She's the only one who gets to have a holodeck, no one else has it. So that was also kind of funny. So she goes to her quarters in the future, I guess somewhere in season 3, right after the retrofit. And for some reason her quarters was the first place that the holodeck was installed on. And so she goes there to get it, and suddenly Book shows up. And that was in the time in which they were together. And so she kind of looks at him and gets tempted by him. So even though she's on the clock to save the ship, she has time for a quick quickie with Book. And so Stamens gathers all the materials he needs to build his device, but they still cannot get to the time bug because of the temporal shields preventing anything from touching it. And Raynor almost lost his hand because he was just willing to just use his hand to get to the bug, and Stamens stopped him in the last moment, so that was kind of stupid. And then they say the only way to breach that temporal shield is to use relativity. And they say that normally the laws of relativity don't apply on the ship because of the warp bubble. But if they go to maximum warp and then break the warp bubble, that will cause the relativity laws to affect these temporal shields of the spider. And then they'll be able to get to it. But it's very dangerous, and they say that the inertial dampeners will be able to keep the ship together despite of doing that. And then Michael has to go to the bridge to convince the crew to help them. And this is the crew of the early season 1, when she was still a mutineer who just came on board the ship and no one would trust her. And then she will have to convince them somehow. So she goes to the bridge, and on the way there she meets her past self, who she's unable to convince. So somehow she'll later be able to convince the rest of the crew when she cannot even convince herself from the past. Which is kind of ridiculous. She has to resort to physical fighting with herself and to beating herself, because only Michael can beat Michael, and the Michael from the past doesn't believe herself from the future, because she says it makes no sense that a mutineer will ever get to be a Starfleet captain, and she's kind of right, it doesn't really make sense. So that's funny, the way the show kind of acknowledges it, that even Michael from the past doesn't believe it makes any sense. And then they have to fight it out, and then the Michael from the future is able to win, I guess because she's more experienced. And she gives a Vulcan nerve pinch to her past self, and then goes to the bridge, and then is able to convince the rest of the crew somehow, by telling them things about themselves that only she would know, because she's their bestest friend ever in the future. And that's how she's able to convince them to help her. And then they do go to warp, and then they break out of the warp bubble, and then they are able to get to the spider. But Raynor uses his bare hand for some reason. Why not attach some stick to it or something? No, he uses his bare hand to get that device on the spider, and it causes his hand to age rapidly, kind of like what happened with Picard in the episode Timescape in TNG. And you know, when it happened with Picard, he had no idea it's going to happen. And yet here they knew that's the case. They knew that field is making the time move faster around it. So why didn't he attach some stick or something to the device instead of doing it with his bare hand? Doesn't really make any sense. And when Michael first tries to convince the bridge crew of all of it, they don't believe her either. And somehow only Arium believes her after Michael reveals to her how she's going to die. How exactly is that the point in which she starts believing her? It makes no sense. I mean, when she told everyone about all kinds of private little things that she knows about it, that didn't convince them. But telling Arium something which haven't happened yet somehow does convince her. So it doesn't really make any sense. But eventually they do what she asks, and they go to warp, and then they break out of the warp bubble, which somehow causes something with the relativity laws, which affects the spider's temporal shields, enabling Raynor to get his hand to the spider with that device, which causes his hand to age rapidly, which makes it stupid. Why didn't he use a stick? And right before they do it, Michael from season 1 and Rhys from season 1 come there and try to stop them, and then Raynor uses his knowledge of talking with Rice for 20 seconds in the previous episode because Michael forced him to do it, and just because of that he manages to convince him to stand down, and then talks with Michael and uses what she told him just a few scenes earlier about her fears being on the bridge and stuff like that. He talks with her, and that's what convinces her as well. And it's funny how Michael acts like almost like mirror universe Michael throughout all the past segments. The way she's kind of angry and the way she talks and moves, it's exactly like the mirror universe Michael from the early seasons. And I don't think that's the way she was behaving in season 1. So after they get that device on the spider, suddenly everything comes back to normal and they're back in the present. And it's as if nothing ever happened, even though 6 hours went missing. So that again begs the question, how exactly did all of it look like from the side? Was the ship just frozen in time during those 6 hours for an outside observer? They never explain any of it. Was just the crew frozen, since Adira says that she somehow knows that 6 hours passed when she just blinked for that time? So is the ship's clock showing the right clock or what? So they never explain any of it. And Michael and Raynor are back in the ready room where it all started, and now Raynor admits how much he was right about everything, how connecting and knowing the crew was so important, because without it he wouldn't have been able to convince them in the past. And so he's now praising her, and so it was all so convenient that it all happened at just the right moment of their argument, that the universe itself twisted everything around them to make Michael right and to convince him that she was right about everything all along. So that's awfully convenient. The whole universe bends around them to prove her right. So that was kind of funny. And that's the end of the episode. And nothing actually progressed forward in the bigger story. They didn't have any new clues to the bigger story arc. And so this episode was absolutely ridiculous and nothing makes any sense if you actually think about it. But in some ways it was kind of fun, maybe because of it. Especially all those ridiculous scenes of seeing Tilly back in the season 1 uniform, pretending as if it's season 1 Tilly while looking like season 5 Tilly. And all the other cameos, and the way Michael had to fight with herself in the past, and all those ridiculous scenes which were kind of entertaining despite of or because of it being so ridiculous that it was just so funny. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.